Detective Frank O'Brien's weathered hand froze mid-reach for his radio as Thunder, his 9-year-old German Shepherd partner, collapsed onto the marble floor of courtroom 3B with a sickening thud. The mighty dog's legs buckled beneath him, his breathing shallow and labored, foam gathering at the corners of his graying muzzle. What happened next defied everything Frank thought he knew about life and death. The bailiff's clipboard clattered to the ground as gasps echoed through the packed courtroom. Court stenographer Margaret Sullivan instinctively pulled her 3-year-old daughter Grace closer, but the child broke free and walked deliberately toward the dying animal. Frank's throat constricted as memories flooded back. Thunder saving that drowning child last summer, the way his tail still wagged even when his hips screamed in pain, how he'd been Frank's only family since Martha's funeral 2 years ago. "Get the vet." "Now!" Frank barked into his radio, his voice cracking despite 32 years of forced composure. Grace knelt beside Thunder and whispered something into his ear. The dog's eyes snapped open, alert and purposeful, as if awakened from death itself. What had this child said? And why did Frank suddenly feel like their lives had just changed forever? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Cedar Falls, Iowa had seen better days. The once thriving farming community now struggled with a population that had dwindled from 12,000 to barely 8,000 souls. Main Street bore the scars of economic decline. Empty storefronts with faded "for lease" signs, the old Woolworths, now a dollar store, and the historic courthouse where Frank O'Brien had served for 32 years, scheduled for demolition in just 3 months. Detective Frank O'Brien had weathered every storm Cedar Falls could throw at him. At 58, his Irish-American features were etched with lines that spoke of countless sleepless nights and too many crime scenes. His thick silver hair, once auburn like his late wife Martha's, was always perfectly combed despite his working-class roots. Frank lived alone now in the modest 2-bedroom ranch house he'd shared with Martha for 26 years, where her reading glasses still sat on the nightstand and her coffee mug remained unwashed in the sink, a shrine to a love that death couldn't diminish. Thunder had been Frank's salvation after Martha's passing. The German Shepherd had come to him 3 years ago, a veteran K-9 officer whose previous partner had retired early due to injury. At 9 years old, Thunder was considered ancient in dog years, but his intelligence remained razor-sharp. His black and tan coat showed patches of gray around his muzzle, and his once powerful hindquarters moved with the careful deliberation of arthritis. But his amber eyes still held the fierce loyalty that made him legendary among Iowa's law enforcement community. Margaret Maggie Sullivan occupied the court stenographer's chair with the quiet dignity of a woman who'd learned to shoulder burdens too heavy for her 36 years. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical bun, and her simple navy dress spoke of someone who chose function over fashion out of necessity rather than preference. Widowed 2 years ago when her husband Danny was killed by an IED in Afghanistan, Maggie worked 2 jobs. Court stenographer by day, bookkeeper for Henderson's feed store by night, just to keep their small apartment above the bakery. Grace Catherine Sullivan possessed the unsettling wisdom that sometimes appears in children who've experienced loss too early. At 3 years old, she had her father's penetrating blue eyes and her mother's determined chin. While other children her age played with toys, Grace seemed drawn to wounded things. Stray cats, injured birds, and now, apparently, dying police dogs. Her vocabulary far exceeded her years, though she rarely spoke unless she had something important to say. Judge William "Bill" Patterson commanded respect in Cedar Falls like few men could. At 63, his 30-year tenure on the bench had earned him the reverence typically reserved for clergy or beloved teachers. His silver hair was always impeccably styled, his black robes pressed to perfection, and his decisions were considered the gold standard of jurisprudence throughout central Iowa. Families had trusted him with their most precious disputes for 3 decades, and his reputation was as solid as the courthouse cornerstone that bore his name. None of them knew that within 48 hours, their quiet Iowa lives would be shattered forever. The routine fraud case of Morrison versus Cedar Falls Development should have been straightforward. Linda Morrison, a soft-spoken accountant in her late 20s, claimed her former employer had systematically falsified construction permits and safety inspections across 17 residential projects. The evidence seemed clear-cut: altered documents, forged signatures, and financial irregularities that pointed to a conspiracy involving city officials and private contractors. Frank had brought Thunder to the courthouse that Tuesday morning as part of standard security protocol for high-profile cases. The old German Shepherd moved slowly up the marble steps, his arthritis more pronounced in the October chill, but his nose remained as sharp as ever. Frank noticed how Thunder paused at the courthouse entrance, his head tilting slightly as if catching a scent that troubled him, but dismissed it as the dog's usual caution around crowds. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Judge Patterson presided from his elevated bench with his characteristic calm authority, while attorneys shuffled through boxes of evidence documents. Linda Morrison sat rigidly in the witness section, her hands folded tightly in her lap, eyes darting nervously between the exit and the defense table where 3 well-dressed lawyers representing Cedar Falls Development whispered among themselves. Thunder had been resting quietly beside Frank's chair near the back of the courtroom when it happened. Without warning, the dog's legs gave way beneath him, and he collapsed with a sound that seemed to echo off the high ceiling like a gunshot. The collapse was violent and sudden, not the gradual weakening Frank had been dreading as Thunder aged, but something else entirely. Maggie Sullivan's stenographer machine stopped clicking as she instinctively reached for Grace, but the 3-year-old had already slipped from her mother's protective grasp. The child moved with purpose that seemed impossible for someone her age, weaving between the stunned courtroom observers with an urgency that made Frank's chest tighten. Grace knelt beside Thunder's still form and placed her small hand on his graying head. Her lips moved against his ear in a whisper so soft that even Frank, crouched beside them, couldn't make out the words. But whatever Grace said caused an immediate transformation. Thunder's eyes, which had been glazing over with the familiar look Frank had seen in dying animals, suddenly snapped alert. The dog's breathing steadied, his muscles tensed with renewed purpose, and he struggled to his feet with a determination that defied his apparent medical crisis. Thunder's nose began working immediately, scanning the air with the methodical precision of a dog who had detected something significant. His head swiveled toward the evidence table where dozens of manila folders and document boxes sat in neat rows. A low whine escaped his throat, not the sound of pain Frank had expected, but the distinctive alert signal Thunder used when he detected narcotics or explosives. "What is it, old boy?" Frank whispered, his hand finding the familiar spot behind Thunder's ears that had always calmed the dog. But Thunder wasn't interested in comfort. He was locked onto something that had triggered every instinct honed through 9 years of police work. Judge Patterson's gavel struck the bench twice. "Is there a problem with the animal, Detective O'Brien? Perhaps we should call for a recess until—" Thunder's bark cut through Patterson's words like a blade. It wasn't the deep, authoritative bark Frank knew well, but something higher-pitched, more urgent. The dog took 3 careful steps toward the evidence table, then sat in the classic alert position, spine straight, eyes fixed, every muscle in his body communicating that he had found what he was looking for. Frank's radio crackled to life. "Unit 7, this is dispatch. We have a medical emergency request for a K-9 officer at the courthouse. Do you need veterinary assistance?" "Negative, dispatch," Frank replied, his eyes never leaving Thunder's focused posture. "Stand by." The transformation in the courtroom was palpable. The defense attorneys had stopped their whispered consultations and were staring at Thunder with expressions that had shifted from mild annoyance to something approaching alarm. Linda Morrison sat forward in her chair, her nervous fidgeting replaced by intense attention. Even Judge Patterson leaned forward from his bench, his composed demeanor showing the first cracks of uncertainty Frank had ever witnessed. Grace remained beside Thunder, her small hand still resting on the dog's back, as if providing some kind of strength or communication that Frank couldn't understand. When she looked up at him with those penetrating blue eyes, Frank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October weather. He says the papers are wrong," Grace announced in her clear, childlike voice that somehow carried to every corner of the silent courtroom. "Someone changed them to hurt people." Thunder barked once more, sharp and definitive, his nose pointing directly at a specific box labeled Morrison Evidence File Number 3. Frank realized that what had started as a routine fraud case was about to become something much more dangerous. Frank's 32 years of police experience had taught him to trust Thunder's instincts above his own judgment, but what happened next challenged everything he thought he knew about his mentor and the justice system he'd served his entire adult life. Judge Patterson's reaction to Thunder's alert was immediate and telling. Instead of the curiosity or cooperation Frank expected from a respected jurist, Patterson's face drained of color and his hands gripped the edges of his bench until his knuckles went white. "Detective O'Brien," Patterson said, his voice carrying an edge Frank had never heard before, "I think it would be best if you remove the animal from my courtroom immediately. Clearly, he's experiencing some kind of medical episode that's disrupting these proceedings." Frank stood slowly, his hand instinctively moving to Thunder's head as the dog maintained his rigid, alert position. In 9 years of partnership, Thunder had never given a false alert. Not once. The German Shepherd's nose could detect cocaine residue on bills that had passed through drug transactions months earlier, could find bodies buried 3 feet underground, could identify explosive compounds that human technology missed. If Thunder was alerting to evidence box number 3, there was something in that box that didn't belong. "Your Honor," Frank said carefully, "with all due respect, I'd like to examine the contents of that evidence box before we dismiss Thunder's alert. Standard protocol requires—" "Standard protocol," Patterson interrupted, his voice rising slightly, "requires that you follow the orders of the presiding judge. Remove the dog, detective. Now." The courthouse had fallen into an uncomfortable silence that seemed to stretch like piano wire about to snap. Maggie Sullivan's stenographer machine sat idle as she watched the exchange with growing alarm. The defense attorneys shuffled papers nervously, their earlier confidence replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. Linda Morrison had gone pale, her eyes darting between Thunder, Frank, and the evidence table as if she were witnessing the collapse of her last hope for justice. Grace Sullivan broke the tension with the devastating honesty that only children possess. "Why is the judge man scared of Thunder?" she asked in her clear voice that carried to every corner of the courtroom. "Thunder only gets excited when he finds bad things that people try to hide." Frank felt the floor shift beneath his feet as the implications of Grace's innocent observation hit him like a physical blow. In 32 years of serving warrants, investigating crimes, and testifying in court, he had never questioned Judge Patterson's integrity. The man had been his mentor when Frank was a rookie, had attended Martha's funeral, had been the rock upon which Cedar Falls' justice system was built. Thunder whined again, more urgently this time, and took another step toward evidence box number 3. The dog's behavior was becoming more agitated by the moment, as if whatever he was detecting was growing stronger or more important. Frank had seen this escalation before, usually when Thunder was closing in on a major drug bust or when they were getting closer to finding a missing child. "Your Honor," Frank said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. "I'm going to have to insist on examining that evidence box. Thunder's alert constitutes probable cause for a search, and I have a legal obligation to investigate." Patterson's face flushed red. "You have a legal obligation to follow court orders, Detective. Security. Remove this officer and his animal from my courtroom immediately." But the courthouse security guard, a young man named Tommy Patterson, the judge's own grandson, stood frozen near the door, clearly torn between his grandfather's orders and the respect he'd always held for Frank O'Brien. Frank had taught Tommy to throw a baseball in the courthouse parking lot during slow summer days. The boy had grown up believing his grandfather was the most honorable man in Cedar Falls. Frank made the decision that would change everything. He walked to evidence box number 3 and opened it, Thunder immediately pressing his nose to the contents with urgent intensity. Inside were the expected documents, construction permits, safety inspections, financial records, but Thunder's nose was focused on something else entirely. A small plastic evidence bag containing what appeared to be cocaine residue was tucked between manila folders, nearly invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. "Jesus Christ," Frank whispered, his voice barely audible. The drugs weren't part of the Morrison case evidence. Someone had planted them in the box, and given Thunder's reaction, they'd been there long enough for the scent to permeate the surrounding documents. Judge Patterson rose from his bench, his face now ashen. "Detective O'Brien, you are in contempt of this court. I'm ordering your immediate arrest for interference with judicial proceedings." But Frank wasn't listening anymore. His mind was racing through years of cases, convictions that had seemed airtight, defendants who had protested their innocence with desperate conviction. How many times had Judge Patterson been the deciding factor? How many evidence boxes had passed through his courtroom? How many lives had been destroyed by planted evidence that Thunder's nose could have detected if anyone had thought to bring a drug dog to examine court evidence? Thunder looked up at Frank with those intelligent amber eyes that had seen so much over their years together. The dog was dying. Frank could see it in the way he favored his left rear leg, in the labored breathing that had nothing to do with excitement, in the slight tremor that had developed in his hindquarters. But Thunder was still trying to do his job, still trying to protect and serve, even as his body failed him. Grace walked over to Frank and tugged on his uniform sleeve. "Thunder says there are more bad papers," she announced with the matter-of-fact tone of someone delivering a weather report. "Lots more, hidden in the man's office upstairs." Frank looked at Judge Patterson, the man who had been like a father to him, the pillar of the community who had dedicated his life to justice. And for the first time in 32 years of service, Frank O'Brien drew his service weapon in a courtroom. The standoff in courtroom 3B lasted exactly 47 seconds, though it felt like an eternity to everyone present. Frank's service weapon remained steady in his grip, pointed not at Judge Patterson, but at the floor between them, a compromise between duty and 30 years of respect for the man who had shaped his understanding of justice. Thunder remained in his alert position beside evidence box number 3, his breathing becoming more labored with each passing moment, but his focus never wavering from the corruption he had detected. "Frank," Judge Patterson said, his voice taking on the paternal tone that had guided Frank through countless difficult cases over the decades, "you're making a terrible mistake. Put the weapon down, and we can discuss this like rational men. That dog is clearly sick, probably hallucinating scents that aren't there. You know how painful it is to watch a beloved animal suffer through their final days?" The words hit Frank like physical blows because they contained just enough truth to be devastating. Thunder was dying. The veterinarian had been clear about that 3 months ago when the kidney disease diagnosis came back. Frank had been living with the knowledge that every day could be Thunder's last, had been preparing himself for the inevitable goodbye that every K-9 officer dreaded. But Thunder's nose had never lied. Not once in 9 years of partnership. Maggie Sullivan clutched Grace protectively, but the 3-year-old seemed remarkably calm for a child witnessing what could become a violent confrontation. "The judge man is lying," Grace announced with the devastating honesty that only children possess. "Thunder isn't sick in his nose, he's sick in his kidneys, but his nose still works perfect." "That's what makes dogs special." Frank's radio crackled with urgent voices as word spread through the Cedar Falls Police Department that their senior detective had drawn his weapon in a courtroom. Chief Morrison's voice cut through the static. "Frank, this is Bill Morrison. Stand down immediately. We're sending backup to assist with whatever situation you're facing." The irony wasn't lost on Frank that Chief Morrison shared a surname with Linda Morrison, the accountant whose fraud case had unraveled into this nightmare. Cedar Falls was small enough that everyone was connected to everyone else through marriage, friendship, or shared history. If Judge Patterson had been systematically corrupting cases for years, the ripple effects would touch every family in town. Thunder whined again, more urgently this time, and took several painful steps toward the courtroom door. His message was clear to Frank. There was more evidence to find, and time was running out. The German Shepherd's legs shook with the effort of standing, but his determination remained unbreakable. Frank had seen this behavior before. When Thunder was tracking a suspect, the dog would follow a scent trail even if it killed him. Linda Morrison finally broke her terrified silence. "Detective O'Brien," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but carrying clearly in the hushed courtroom, "there's something you need to know. Judge Patterson approached me 3 weeks ago. He said he knew about evidence that would guarantee I'd win my case, but I had to promise never to mention our conversation." Judge Patterson's face went white. "That's a lie. I've never spoken privately with any witness in this case." "You met me at Henderson's Diner on October 3rd, Linda continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. "You bought me coffee and told me that sometimes justice needed a little help to find its way. You said the Cedar Falls development people had been getting away with murder for years, and it was time someone made them pay." Frank felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. Judge Patterson hadn't been taking bribes to let guilty people go free. He'd been planting evidence to ensure convictions he believed were morally justified. In his twisted logic, he was still serving justice, just using illegal methods to guarantee the outcomes he felt were right. Thunder began moving toward the door with painful determination, and Frank made the decision to follow his partner's lead. "Your Honor," he said, holstering his weapon but keeping his hand ready, "I'm going to follow Thunder's nose wherever it leads. If you're innocent of any wrongdoing, you'll help me clear this up. If you're not—" "If I'm not what, Frank?" Patterson's voice carried a dangerous edge. "If I'm not willing to watch guilty people walk free because some technicality prevents justice from being served, if I'm not content to see families destroyed because the system protects predators and corporations over victims." The admission hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Judge Patterson had just confessed to tampering with evidence, though he seemed to believe he was defending his actions rather than incriminating himself. Frank realized with growing horror that his mentor had convinced himself that corruption in service of his personal version of justice was somehow noble. Thunder made it to the courtroom door and sat in another alert position, his nose pointing up toward the second floor where Judge Patterson's chambers were located. The dog's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, but his eyes remained bright with purpose. Frank had seen that look before. Thunder would complete this mission if it was the last thing he did. "Tommy," Frank called to the young security guard who was still frozen by the door, "I need you to unlock Judge Patterson's chambers. Thunder's indicating there's evidence up there." Tommy Patterson looked between his grandfather and Frank, his young face twisted with confusion and growing understanding. "Grandpa," he said, his voice cracking with emotion, "what's happening? What did you do?" Judge Patterson's composure finally cracked completely. "What did I do?" he shouted, his voice echoing off the courtroom walls. "I'll tell you what I did, boy. I made sure that bastards who hurt innocent people got what they deserved. I made sure that companies like Cedar Falls Development couldn't hide behind lawyers and buy their way out of justice. I made sure that when good people like Linda Morrison got stepped on by the system, someone was there to level the playing field." Frank understood now why Thunder's alerts had been so urgent. The dog wasn't just detecting planted drugs in evidence boxes, he was detecting the scent of corruption that had been building for years. Every case that had passed through Judge Patterson's courtroom was now suspect. Every conviction could be overturned. Every family that had trusted the justice system to protect them had been betrayed by the very man they'd trusted most. Maggie Sullivan spoke up from her stenographer's position, her voice shaking with emotion. "Judge Patterson, my husband died believing he was fighting for justice in Afghanistan. He died believing that the system back home was worth protecting. How many other families have you lied to? How many people are sitting in prison right now because you decided you knew better than the law?" Thunder began climbing the stairs to the second floor, each step clearly causing him pain, but his determination unwavering. Frank followed, keeping one eye on his partner and another on Judge Patterson, who seemed to be calculating his options. The courthouse was old, with multiple exits and hiding places, but Thunder's nose would find whatever Patterson had hidden. Grace Sullivan's voice drifted up from the courtroom below, clear and innocent and absolutely devastating. "Thunder says the bad man has been hurting people for a really long time. But Thunder's tired now, and he needs to finish his job so he can rest." Frank realized that his partner was literally giving his life to expose the corruption that had poisoned Cedar Falls' justice system. Thunder knew he was dying, knew that every step up those stairs brought him closer to his final breath, but the old German Shepherd was determined to complete one last mission in service of the truth. At the top of the stairs, Thunder collapsed again, his legs finally unable to support his weight. But his nose remained pointed directly at Judge Patterson's chamber door, and his eyes were still bright with the intelligence that had made him legendary among Iowa law enforcement. Frank knelt beside his partner and whispered, "Good boy, Thunder, the best boy. Just a little bit more, old friend." Thunder's tail tapped once against the marble floor, their old signal that meant "Roger that, partner." And Frank knew that whatever they found behind that door would either save or damn them all. Judge Patterson's chambers held the accumulated weight of 30 years of judicial authority. Law books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, their leather bindings worn smooth by decades of consultation. A massive mahogany desk dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with neat stacks of pending cases and a silver-framed photograph of Patterson's late son, Michael, in his army dress uniform. The American flag stood in one corner, its fabric perfectly pressed, while certificates and commendations covered the wall behind the desk like a shrine to a distinguished career. Thunder's nose led them directly to a filing cabinet in the corner, its 4 drawers locked with a security system that seemed excessive for routine court documents. The German Shepherd's alert intensified as they approached, his whining taking on an urgency that Frank recognized from major drug busts. Whatever was hidden in those files had been there long enough for the scent to permeate everything nearby. Frank tried the top drawer, locked. He looked back at Judge Patterson, who had followed them upstairs with the resigned air of a man who knew his secrets were about to be exposed. "The combination, Bill. Don't make this harder than it has to be." "You don't understand what you're asking me to do," Patterson said, his voice heavy with something between regret and defiance. "Those files contain 15 years of real justice, Frank, not the watered-down, technicality-ridden nonsense that lets criminals walk free on procedural grounds. I'm talking about justice that actually protects innocent people." Thunder collapsed beside the filing cabinet, his strength finally failing him, but his nose remained pointed at the locked drawers. Frank knelt beside his partner and felt the irregular rhythm of the dog's heartbeat. The way his breathing had become shallow and labored. Time was running out for Thunder, but the old German shepherd's eyes still burned with determination to complete this final mission. Grace Sullivan's voice drifted up from the stairwell as she climbed slowly toward them, her small hand trailing along the banister. "Thunder says the bad papers are in the bottom drawer," she announced with the matter-of-fact tone of someone relaying a simple message. "He says there are pictures too, and money, and things that prove people lied." Frank looked at the 3-year-old with amazement that had moved beyond shock into acceptance. Grace's ability to interpret Thunder's signals had moved far beyond coincidence into something that defied rational explanation. But Frank had learned to trust what he couldn't understand. In 32 years of police work, he'd seen enough unexplainable connections between humans and animals to know that some bonds transcended normal communication. Patterson's laugh was bitter and hollow. "You're going to take the word of a dying dog and a toddler over 30 years of judicial service. Frank, I've known you since you were a rookie. I was at your wedding. I held your hand at Martha's funeral. Doesn't that count for something?" "It counts for everything, Bill," Frank said, his voice breaking with emotion. "That's what makes this so goddamn heartbreaking. You were my mentor. You were supposed to be the one person in this system I could trust completely." Frank used his baton to break the lock on the bottom drawer, the sound of splintering metal echoing through the chamber like a gunshot. Inside, he found exactly what Grace had described: manila folders filled with photographs, financial records, and correspondence that painted a picture of systematic corruption spanning more than a decade. The first folder contained photographs of crime scenes that Frank remembered investigating. But these weren't the official crime scene photos from police files. These images showed evidence being planted, documents being switched, and substances being added to evidence bags. Someone had been documenting Judge Patterson's corruption for years, creating an insurance policy of mutually assured destruction. Frank's hands shook as he opened the second folder. Financial records showed payments totaling more than $200,000 over 5 years, money that had flowed from various sources into offshore accounts controlled by Patterson. But these weren't bribes to let guilty people go free. They were payments for ensuring convictions of specific defendants, regardless of the actual evidence. Thunder whimpered softly, and Frank looked down to see his partner's condition deteriorating rapidly. The dog's breathing was becoming increasingly labored, and his eyes were starting to lose focus. Frank had seen this progression before in other animals. Thunder was entering the final stages of kidney failure, his body shutting down system by system. "Bill," Frank said, his voice thick with grief for both his dying partner and his fallen mentor, "how many innocent people are sitting in prison because of these files? How many families have been destroyed because you decided you knew better than the law?" Judge Patterson slumped against the wall, suddenly looking every one of his 63 years. "Michael was building houses for Cedar Falls development when that scaffolding collapsed," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. 18 years old, working his way through college, trying to make his old man proud. The company knew that scaffolding was defective. They had reports, warnings, inspection failures they'd covered up. But when the wrongful death lawsuit came to trial, their lawyers made it all disappear. Technicalities, procedural errors, statute of limitations. "As my son died for their profit margins and the law protected them." Frank understood now. Judge Patterson's corruption hadn't started with greed or power. It had started with grief and a father's need for justice that the system couldn't provide. The first planted evidence, the first falsified report, had probably been motivated by genuine desire to protect other families from suffering his loss. But corruption, like cancer, had a way of metastasizing until it consumed everything it touched. Grace climbed onto Thunder's prone form and laid her small head against his neck. "Thunder says he's proud of you," she told Frank, her voice carrying the innocent wisdom that had guided them this far. "He says you're the best partner he ever had. And he's ready to go see the other police dogs who went to heaven before him." Frank's vision blurred with tears he'd been holding back for months. Thunder had been more than a partner. He'd been Frank's anchor after Martha's death, the one constant in a world that seemed determined to take away everything he loved. The thought of losing Thunder while simultaneously discovering his mentor's betrayal felt like more than one heart could bear. Thunder's tail moved slightly against the floor, one last "Roger that, partner," and Frank knew his friend was saying goodbye. The old German shepherd had given everything he had to expose the corruption that had poisoned their community's justice system. He'd literally worked himself to death in service of the truth. "The third folder," Grace said softly, still stroking Thunder's head. "Thunder says it's the most important one. It has the names of people who are still in jail who shouldn't be there." Frank opened the third folder with trembling hands and found a list of 47 names. 47 people who had been convicted based on evidence that Judge Patterson had admitted to planting or manipulating. 47 lives destroyed in service of Patterson's twisted version of justice. 47 families torn apart because one man had decided he could improve on the Constitution. Among the names, Frank recognized people he had arrested, cases he had investigated, defendants he had testified against. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had been an unwitting accomplice in Patterson's corruption for years. Every arrest he'd made based on planted evidence, every conviction he'd helped secure through falsified reports, he bore responsibility for the destruction of innocent lives. Thunder's breathing became increasingly shallow, each breath requiring tremendous effort. Frank knelt beside his partner and whispered, "You did good, old boy. You saved so many people today. Rest now. Martha's waiting for you on the other side." The German shepherd's eyes found Frank's one last time, filled with the intelligence and loyalty that had defined their partnership. Then Thunder closed his eyes and went still, his final breath escaping in a soft sigh that seemed to carry the weight of 9 years of faithful service. Judge Patterson was weeping openly now, the full magnitude of his crimes finally overwhelming his rationalizations. "I never meant for it to go this far," he sobbed. "I just wanted justice for Michael. I just wanted to make sure other families didn't suffer like we did." Frank stood slowly, Thunder's still form at his feet and 47 lives weighing on his conscience. The next few hours would bring media attention, federal investigations, and the complete dismantling of Cedar Falls' justice system. But first, he had to call Chief Morrison and begin the process of undoing 15 years of corrupted convictions. Thunder's sacrifice had exposed the truth, but the real work of rebuilding justice was just beginning. The silence that followed Thunder's final breath seemed to expand through Judge Patterson's chambers like ripples on still water. Frank remained kneeling beside his partner's still form, one hand resting on the German shepherd's graying head, unable to process that the dog who had been his anchor for 3 years was gone. Thunder's body looked smaller in death, the powerful muscles that had carried him through countless investigations, now relaxed into the peaceful stillness that Frank had dreaded for months. Grace Sullivan climbed down from Thunder's side and walked to Frank, her small hand finding his much larger one. "Thunder says thank you," she whispered, her 3-year-old voice carrying a weight that seemed impossible for someone her age. "He says he's not hurting anymore and he's proud that he finished his job." Frank's throat constricted as he looked down at the child who had somehow translated his partner's final mission. In 32 years of police work, he had seen many things that defied rational explanation, but Grace's connection to Thunder transcended anything in his experience. the little girl had guided them to evidence that would overturn decades of corrupted justice, speaking for a dying dog with an accuracy that couldn't be coincidence. Judge Patterson sat slumped against his bookshelf, tears streaming down his face as he stared at the files that documented his 15-year descent from respected jurist to systematic criminal. "Frank," he said, his voice broken and hollow, "I know you'll never forgive me. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I need you to understand that it started with love. Everything I did, every law I broke, every life I destroyed, it all started because I loved my son, and I couldn't bear to watch his killers walk free." "Bill," Frank said, his voice thick with grief for both Thunder and the mentor he thought he'd known, "love doesn't justify what you did to those 47 families. Love doesn't excuse destroying innocent lives to satisfy your need for revenge." The sound of footsteps on the courthouse stairs announced the arrival of Chief Morrison and the backup Frank had requested. Within minutes, Judge Patterson's chambers filled with law enforcement officers, EMTs, and officials from the Iowa Attorney General's office who had been monitoring the situation through Frank's radio transmissions. The small room became crowded with people processing what would become the largest corruption scandal in Cedar Falls history. Chief Morrison, a heavy-set man with kind eyes who had worked alongside Frank for over a decade, knelt beside Thunder's body with the respect due a fallen officer. "He was the best K-9 we ever had," Morrison said quietly. "Saved more lives than we'll ever know. Hell of a way to go out, exposing the biggest corruption case in state history." Dr. Rebecca Hayes from the Attorney General's office began photographing and cataloging the contents of the filing cabinet, while federal agents secured the scene. As the scope of Judge Patterson's crimes became clear through the documentation he had meticulously kept, the implications rippled outward like shock waves from an earthquake. 47 wrongful convictions meant 47 appeals, 47 overturned sentences, and potentially millions of dollars in civil litigation against the state. Maggie Sullivan arrived breathless at the chamber door, having climbed the stairs with the desperate urgency of a mother who had lost sight of her child in a dangerous situation. When she saw Grace standing calmly beside Frank and Thunder's still form, relief flooded her features before being replaced by the dawning understanding of what had transpired. "Gracie," Maggie said, kneeling to embrace her daughter. "What happened up here? Are you okay?" Grace nodded solemnly. "Thunder finished his job, Mama. He found all the bad papers that were hurting people, and now the good people can go home to their families. But Thunder had to go to heaven to be with the other police dogs because his body was too tired to keep working." Frank watched the interaction between mother and daughter with a mixture of amazement and profound sadness. Grace's matter-of-fact acceptance of death and her apparent understanding of complex adult concepts suggested either remarkable maturity or something beyond normal childhood development. Either way, her guidance had been instrumental in exposing the corruption that had poisoned Cedar Falls' justice system. Linda Morrison appeared in the doorway, her face pale but determined. "Detective O'Brien," she said, "I need to tell you something else about Judge Patterson. 3 weeks ago, he didn't just offer to help my case. He told me that sometimes the system fails good people, and when that happens, good people have to help the system find its way back to justice. He said he'd been helping the system for 15 years. Frank's blood ran cold as he realized the full scope of Patterson's corruption. The judge hadn't just been planting evidence in random cases. He had been systematically targeting defendants he believed deserved punishment, regardless of their actual guilt or innocence. Patterson had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner for an entire community, destroying the constitutional protections that form the foundation of American justice. Dr. Hayes looked up from her documentation of the files. Detective O'Brien, based on what we're finding here, we're looking at potential federal civil rights violations, conspiracy charges, and corruption spanning multiple administrations. This investigation is going to require resources from the FBI, the Justice Department, and probably the Iowa Supreme Court. We're talking about potentially thousands of people whose cases may need to be reviewed. Judge Patterson struggled to his feet, his dignity stripped away but his voice still carrying traces of the authority that had commanded respect for 3 decades. "Frank, before they take me away, I need you to know something. Those files contain evidence of other corruption too. City officials, contractors, police officers who knew what I was doing and looked the other way because it served their interests. This goes deeper than just me." Frank felt the weight of those words like a physical blow. If Patterson was telling the truth, the corruption had infected not just the judicial system, but potentially the entire power structure of Cedar Falls. Police officers Frank had worked alongside for years, city officials he had trusted, contractors who had built the homes where his neighbors raised their children, all potentially complicit in a conspiracy that had destroyed dozens of innocent lives. Thunder's body was carefully moved onto a stretcher by the EMTs, who treated the fallen K-9 officer with the reverence due to any law enforcement officer killed in the line of duty. Frank insisted on accompanying Thunder to the veterinary clinic where the German Shepherd would be prepared for burial with full honors. And after 3 years of partnership, Frank couldn't bear the thought of letting someone else handle Thunder's final arrangements. Grace walked beside the stretcher as they carried Thunder down the courthouse stairs, her small hand resting on the dog's still form. "Thunder says not to be sad," she told Frank as they reached the main floor. "He says dying isn't scary when you've spent your whole life protecting people. He says that's what makes dogs and police officers special. They're not afraid to give everything they have for people they love." The courthouse lobby had filled with media representatives, curious citizens, and law enforcement officers from surrounding jurisdictions who had heard about the developing scandal through police communications. Frank pushed through the crowd with Thunder's stretcher, ignoring the shouted questions from reporters and the camera flashes that documented the end of an era in Cedar Falls. Outside, the October afternoon had grown cold and gray, with the kind of overcast sky that seemed to reflect the somber mood that had settled over the community. Frank helped load Thunder into the veterinary transport vehicle, then stood for a long moment with his hand on the door handle, unable to let go of his partner for the final time. Chief Morrison placed a supportive hand on Frank's shoulder. "Take all the time you need, Frank. Thunder earned a hero's farewell, and you've earned the right to grieve. But when you're ready, we're going to need your help sorting through this mess. You knew Patterson better than anyone, and you're going to be crucial in figuring out how deep this corruption goes." Frank nodded, understanding that Thunder's final investigation was just the beginning of what would likely be years of legal proceedings, appeals, and attempts to rebuild public trust in Cedar Falls' justice system. The German Shepherd had given his life to expose the truth, but the real work of restoring justice would fall to the living. As the veterinary transport pulled away with Thunder's body, Frank felt the crushing weight of loss that had become too familiar since Martha's death. But beneath the grief was something else, a sense of purpose that Thunder's sacrifice had renewed. The old dog had died doing what he loved most, protecting innocent people and serving justice. Now it was Frank's turn to honor that legacy. The revelation that shattered everything Frank thought he knew about his career came not from the files they had already discovered, but from a locked safe hidden behind Judge Patterson's law degree certificates. Dr. Rebecca Hayes from the Attorney General's office found it while conducting a thorough search of the chambers, its existence revealed only when she noticed that the wall behind Patterson's desk was slightly thicker than architectural plans indicated it should be. Inside the safe, wrapped in waterproof plastic and organized with the same meticulous attention to detail that had characterized Patterson's 30-year judicial career, were audio recordings, photographs, and financial records that painted a picture of corruption so vast and systematic that it threatened to destroy not just individual lives, but the entire foundation of law enforcement in Cedar Falls. Frank listened to the first audio recording with growing horror, recognizing his own voice from a case 3 years earlier. The recording captured him testifying about evidence he had found during a search, but it had been edited to remove his qualifying statements about chain of custody issues. What should have been testimony that raised questions about evidence integrity had been manipulated to sound like an ironclad case for conviction. "Jesus Christ, Bill," Frank whispered as he realized the scope of the betrayal. "You've been recording my testimony and editing it for 3 years?" Judge Patterson, now handcuffed and sitting under federal supervision, looked at Frank with eyes that held equal parts shame and defiance. "I recorded everyone, Frank. Every officer, every witness, every lawyer who testified in my courtroom. When the system failed to deliver justice, I made sure justice could be served by presenting the truth more clearly." Dr. Hayes held up a photograph that made Frank's stomach lurch. It showed him planting evidence during a drug bust. Except Frank had never planted evidence in his entire career. The photograph had been digitally manipulated to show him placing drugs in a location where he had actually been photographing evidence that was already there. The manipulation was so sophisticated that even experts would need significant time to prove it was fake. "How many officers have you framed with doctored evidence?" Chief Morrison demanded, his voice shaking with rage. "How many good cops are going to have their careers destroyed because you decided to play God with the justice system?" The scope of Patterson's corruption was becoming clear through the safe's contents. He had not only been planting evidence to ensure convictions he believed were morally justified, but he had also been creating insurance policies against anyone who might expose his activities. The files contained compromising material on dozens of law enforcement officers, city officials, and attorneys. Evidence that could be used to destroy careers and reputations if anyone threatened to reveal his operations. Frank found a file with his own name on it and opened it with trembling hands. Inside were photographs of him visiting Thunder at the veterinary clinic during his off-duty hours, financial records showing the money he had spent on Thunder's medical care, and a psychological evaluation that Patterson had somehow obtained from Frank's mandatory counseling sessions after Martha's death. The evaluation noted Frank's emotional dependence on Thunder and suggested that the loss of his canine partner might trigger a psychological breakdown that could compromise his effectiveness as an officer. "You son of a bitch," Frank said, his voice barely controlled. "You were planning to use Martha's death and my grief over Thunder to discredit me if I ever got too close to the truth." Grace Sullivan, who had been sitting quietly beside Maggie while the adults processed the scope of Patterson's crimes, suddenly stood up and walked to the safe. Her small voice cut through the tension in the room with startling clarity. "Thunder says there's more hidden behind the books on the 3rd shelf. He says it's the worst thing, and that's why he had to work so hard to make sure someone found it." Dr. Hayes followed Grace's guidance and discovered another hidden compartment behind a row of legal texts. Inside were medical records, death certificates, and correspondence that revealed the most horrifying aspect of Patterson's corruption. He had been systematically murdering witnesses who threatened to expose his activities. The first file contained the medical records of James Morrison, Linda's husband, who had died 18 months earlier in what had been ruled a heart attack. But the medical records in Patterson's file told a different story. They showed that James had been poisoned with digitalis, a heart medication that could cause fatal cardiac arrest if administered in sufficient quantities. James had been preparing to testify about construction fraud at Cedar Falls Development when he died suddenly at the age of 34 with no previous history of heart problems. Frank's hands shook as he opened the second file and found the death certificate for Maria Santos, a court translator who had died in a car accident 6 months earlier. But Patterson's file contained photographs taken at the accident scene that showed evidence of tampering with the victim's brake lines. Maria had been scheduled to testify about her knowledge of falsified documents in immigration cases when she lost control of her vehicle on a curve she had navigated safely for 15 years. The third file was the one that broke Frank's heart completely. It contained the medical records of Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, Thunder's veterinarian, and Dr. Rebecca Hayes's sister. Elizabeth had died 3 months earlier from what appeared to be complications from routine surgery, but Patterson's file revealed that she had been asking questions about the unusual number of K-9 officers who had been developing kidney disease after working certain cases. She had been preparing to publish a paper about potential environmental toxins affecting police dogs when she suffered fatal complications during what should have been minor gallbladder surgery. Frank realized with sickening clarity that Thunder's kidney disease might not have been natural. Dr. Elizabeth Hayes had been investigating a pattern of illness among K-9 officers, and her death had silenced the one person who might have discovered that Patterson was systematically poisoning police dogs whose keen senses posed a threat to his evidence-planting operations. "Thunder," Frank whispered, looking toward where his partner's body had lain just hours earlier. "He didn't just die of kidney disease. You killed him slowly, didn't you, Bill? You poisoned the dogs who were too good at their jobs." Judge Patterson's facade of moral justification finally cracked completely. "They were getting too close," he admitted, his voice hollow with exhaustion and defeat. "Thunder, Rex from the county sheriff's department, Caesar from the state patrol, they were all detecting scents on evidence that should have been clean. I couldn't let them expose operations that were serving real justice." Dr. Rebecca Hayes sat down heavily in one of Patterson's leather chairs, overwhelmed by the revelation that her sister had been murdered for trying to protect police dogs. "Elizabeth spent her whole career saving animals," she said, tears streaming down her face. "She dedicated her life to healing, and you killed her to protect your sick version of justice." Chief Morrison activated his radio and began coordinating with federal agencies to expand the investigation beyond Cedar Falls. The discovery of multiple murders meant that Patterson's corruption had escalated from judicial misconduct to serial killing, requiring resources and expertise that local law enforcement couldn't provide. The FBI would need to examine every death that had occurred in connection with Patterson's court cases over the past 15 years. Frank found himself studying Grace Sullivan with new understanding. The 3-year-old had guided them not just to evidence of judicial corruption, but to proof of systematic murder. Her ability to interpret Thunder's final investigation had exposed crimes that might never have been discovered otherwise. Thunder had literally given his life to ensure that Patterson's victims would finally receive justice. "Gracie," Frank said gently, kneeling beside the child who had become the key to unraveling 15 years of corruption. "Did Thunder tell you about the other police dogs? Did he know what happened to them?" Grace nodded solemnly. "Thunder says Rex and Caesar and the other police dogs are waiting for him in heaven, and they're proud that he finally found all the bad papers. They're not sad anymore because now everyone knows the truth about what the bad judge man did to them." Maggie Sullivan embraced her daughter protectively, finally understanding the magnitude of what Grace had helped uncover. "How did you know, sweetheart? How could you understand what Thunder was trying to tell us?" "Dogs don't lie, Mama," Grace said with the simple wisdom that had guided them through this nightmare. "They just try to help people even when it hurts. Thunder hurt for a long time, but he kept trying to do his job because that's what good dogs do." Frank realized that Thunder's final investigation had been more than just detecting planted evidence. It had been an act of vengeance for murdered colleagues and justice for victims who had been silenced before they could tell their stories. The old German Shepherd had used the last of his strength to expose a killer who had hidden behind judicial robes for 15 years. Judge Patterson was led away in handcuffs as federal agents began the process of securing evidence and coordinating with multiple agencies. His 30-year reign of corrupted justice was over, but the damage he had caused would take years to fully understand and address. 47 wrongful convictions, multiple murders, and the systematic destruction of public trust in Cedar Falls institutions created problems that would require federal intervention and millions of dollars to resolve. Frank stood in the empty chambers where his mentor had planned and executed crimes that violated every principle of justice they had both sworn to uphold. Thunder's sacrifice had exposed the truth, but the cost had been devastating. Not just Thunder's life, but the lives of Dr. Elizabeth Hayes, James Morrison, Maria Santos, and potentially dozens of other victims whose deaths had been disguised as accidents or natural causes. The revelation that Thunder had been poisoned transformed the German Shepherd's death from natural tragedy to murder, adding another layer of grief to Frank's loss. Thunder had suffered for months, his body slowly failing as Patterson's poison destroyed his kidneys. But the loyal dog had continued working even as he was being killed by the very system he served. Grace walked to the window and looked out at the courthouse parking lot where Thunder's transport had disappeared hours earlier. "Thunder says thank you for being his best friend," she told Frank, her small voice carrying the weight of a final message. "He says he's not hurting anymore, and now all the bad people will be punished for what they did." Frank knelt beside Grace and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, sweetheart. Thunder was lucky to have you speak for him when he couldn't speak for himself." The truth was finally revealed, but Frank knew that the real work of rebuilding justice was just beginning. Thunder's legacy would live on in the lives saved by his final investigation, but the German Shepherd's sacrifice had also revealed the fragility of the institutions that society depended upon to protect the innocent. In exposing Judge Patterson's crimes, Thunder had given Cedar Falls the chance to build something better, a justice system based on truth rather than manipulation, on evidence rather than prejudice, on the rule of law rather than one man's twisted vision of righteousness. The old dog had completed his final mission, and now it was up to the living to honor his sacrifice. 6 months after Thunder's death exposed the largest corruption scandal in Iowa history, Cedar Falls had begun the slow process of rebuilding both its justice system and its faith in the institutions that governed daily life. The old courthouse had been demolished as planned, but instead of the strip mall that developers had envisioned, the community had voted to build a memorial park on the site. At its center stood a bronze statue of a German Shepherd in alert position with a simple plaque that read, "Thunder, K-9 officer. He served justice until his final breath." Frank O'Brien stood before the memorial on a crisp April morning, his breath visible in the spring air as he watched Grace Sullivan, now 4 years old, carefully place a small bouquet of daffodils at the statue's base. Beside him sat Hope, a 6-month-old German Shepherd puppy whose bright amber eyes held the same intelligence that had made Thunder legendary among Iowa law enforcement. Hope wore a small vest identifying her as a K-9 officer in training, and her attention rarely strayed from Frank's movements. Thunder would have liked Hope, Grace said, with the matter-of-fact certainty that still characterized her observations about things she couldn't possibly know through normal means. "She has the same good heart that wants to protect people." The past 6 months had brought changes that no one in Cedar Falls could have imagined. Judge Patterson's conviction on 17 counts of murder, 47 counts of judicial misconduct, and numerous federal civil rights violations had made national headlines. The FBI investigation had uncovered a network of corruption that extended far beyond Cedar Falls, implicating officials in 3 counties and leading to the overturning of more than 200 convictions across Iowa. Maggie Sullivan had been promoted to Director of Court Administration for the newly constructed Thunder Memorial Justice Center, a position that came with both significant responsibility and the financial security she had struggled to achieve since her husband's death in Afghanistan. Her new salary allowed her to move Grace out of the apartment above the bakery and into a small house with a backyard where Hope could run and play when she wasn't training with Frank. Frank had been offered early retirement with full benefits after the investigation revealed the extent to which Patterson had manipulated his testimony and evidence over the years. But instead of accepting the comfortable exit that would have allowed him to grieve Thunder and Martha in peace, Frank had chosen to stay and help rebuild the department's K-9 program. At 59, he found himself training Hope, while also serving as a consultant to other departments seeking to prevent the kind of systematic corruption that had poisoned Cedar Falls. The new Justice Center incorporated lessons learned from Patterson's crimes. All evidence was now handled by multiple officers with digital tracking systems that created permanent records of chain of custody. Court proceedings were recorded with multiple cameras, making it impossible for testimony to be edited or manipulated. Most importantly, K-9 officers were rotated regularly between cases and handlers, preventing any one person from developing the kind of control over police dogs that Patterson had exploited. Dr. Rebecca Hayes had relocated to Cedar Falls to establish the Elizabeth Hayes Veterinary Clinic, specializing in the care of working police dogs. Her sister's murder had inspired her to dedicate her career to protecting the animals who served alongside law enforcement officers. The clinic provided free medical care to all K-9 officers in central Iowa, funded by donations from families whose loved ones had been freed from wrongful imprisonment, thanks to Thunder's final investigation. Linda Morrison had used her settlement from the corruption case to establish a non-profit organization dedicated to supporting the families of wrongfully convicted individuals. The Morrison Foundation provided legal assistance, counseling services, and financial support to help people rebuild their lives after spending years in prison for crimes they hadn't committed. Her husband's death had been avenged through Thunder's sacrifice, but Linda found meaning in ensuring that other families wouldn't suffer the same losses she had experienced. Grace continued to demonstrate her unusual ability to communicate with animals, though her gift had evolved beyond the dramatic circumstances that had first revealed it. She helped Frank train Hope by interpreting the puppy's reactions to various scents and situations, providing insights that accelerated Hope's development beyond normal canine training timelines. Child psychologists who had evaluated Grace concluded that her abilities represented an extreme form of empathy rather than anything supernatural. But Frank knew that scientific explanations couldn't fully capture the depth of her connection to the animals she encountered. The 47 individuals who had been wrongfully convicted based on Patterson's planted evidence were gradually being released from prison as appeals courts reviewed their cases. Each release brought both joy and tragedy, joy for families reunited after years of separation, but tragedy in recognizing the lives that had been destroyed by one man's corruption. Several former inmates had died in prison, their innocence proven too late to save their lives. Others struggled to readjust to a world that had moved on without them, requiring extensive counseling and support services. Frank had visited each released prisoner personally, carrying a photograph of Thunder and explaining how the German Shepherd's final investigation had exposed the corruption that had stolen their freedom. Many broke down when they learned that a dog had given his life to prove their innocence, understanding in a way that touched Frank's heart that Thunder's sacrifice had been motivated by the same sense of justice that they had desperately sought during their years of wrongful imprisonment. Chief Morrison had established the Thunder Award, presented annually to the K-9 officer who demonstrated exceptional dedication to justice and public service. The first recipient was Caesar from the State Patrol, whose handler had discovered that the German Shepherd was also suffering from kidney disease that appeared to be linked to exposure to substances found in evidence rooms. Caesar had undergone successful treatment at Dr. Hayes's clinic and returned to active duty with enhanced protocols designed to protect police dogs from contamination. The citizens of Cedar Falls had responded to the corruption scandal with a determination to rebuild their community's reputation for integrity and justice. Voter turnout in municipal elections had reached record levels as residents took active roles in selecting leaders who would prioritize transparency and accountability. The new city council had implemented oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the concentration of power that had enabled Patterson's crimes. Frank walked through the memorial park with Hope at his side, remembering the countless hours he had spent training Thunder in these same fields when they were just empty lots behind the old courthouse. Hope showed the same eagerness to learn and serve that had characterized Thunder, but she also displayed a gentleness that seemed to reflect the lessons learned from her predecessor's sacrifice. Where Thunder had been intense and driven, Hope was patient and thoughtful, as if she understood that her role was to heal as well as to serve. Grace joined Frank and Hope for their afternoon training session, her presence serving as both inspiration and guidance for the young German Shepherd. Under Grace's interpretation of Hope's responses, Frank could identify subtle reactions that might have taken weeks to recognize through traditional training methods. The 4-year-old's ability to bridge communication between humans and animals had become an invaluable tool in developing the next generation of canine officers. "Hope says she wants to be as brave as Thunder," Grace announced during a break in training, her small hand resting on the puppy's head, "but she also says she wants to help people heal from the hurt that the bad judge man caused." Frank knelt beside Grace and Hope, struck by the wisdom in the child's interpretation. Thunder's legacy wasn't just about exposing corruption, it was about demonstrating the healing power of unconditional loyalty and service to others. Hope would carry that legacy forward, but she would do so in a world that had learned from Thunder's sacrifice and committed itself to preventing future betrayals of public trust. Maggie arrived at the park as the training session concluded, her face showing the contentment of someone who had found both purpose and security after years of struggle. She had begun dating Frank quietly, their shared experience of loss and recovery creating a bond that grew stronger with each passing month. Neither was ready for dramatic declarations of love, but both recognized that they were building something meaningful together. "How did Hope do today?" Maggie asked, watching as the German Shepherd puppy played gentle games with Grace in the spring sunshine. "She's going to be special," Frank replied, his voice carrying the same pride he had felt when describing Thunder's accomplishments. "Maybe not in exactly the same way Thunder was special, but she's got that same heart that wants to protect people." As the sun began to set over Cedar Falls, casting long shadows across the memorial park, Frank reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of hope and renewal. Thunder's death had been devastating, but his final investigation had saved far more lives than his loss had cost. The German Shepherd's sacrifice had exposed a cancer that had been eating away at their community's soul, allowing healing to begin. Grace sat beside Thunder's statue and whispered something too soft for the adults to hear. When she stood up, she announced with her characteristic certainty, "Thunder says he's proud of everyone for working so hard to fix the things that were broken. He says Hope is going to help lots of people, and that makes him happy." Frank placed his hand on the bronze statue's head, feeling the same sense of partnership he had known with Thunder during their years together. The old dog was gone, but his legacy lived on in the reforms his sacrifice had inspired, in the innocent people his investigation had freed, and in the new generation of K-9 officers who would serve with the knowledge that their work was sacred. Thunder had kept his promise to serve and protect until his final breath. Now it was up to the living to honor that promise by building a justice system worthy of his sacrifice. Thunder's story reminds us that love isn't measured by the years we have together, but by the depth of devotion we share in those precious moments. Like many of us who've reached the season of life where we've buried parents, spouses, and beloved pets, Frank discovered that grief can either break us or transform us into something stronger. Thunder's final act of service, exposing corruption even as his body failed, mirrors the quiet heroism we see in our own communities every day. The grandfather who volunteers at the food bank despite his arthritis, the widow who mentors troubled youth, the retired teacher who reads to children at the library. These acts of service don't make headlines, but they change lives. Frank found new purpose not by replacing Thunder, but by honoring his memory through hope, proving that second chances can bring unexpected joy. The story of Cedar Falls shows us that communities heal when good people refuse to stay silent, when justice prevails over convenience, and when love transcends death. Thunder's legacy lives on not in bronze statues, but in the lives he saved and the corruption he exposed. What acts of quiet service have you witnessed in your community that remind you of Thunder's dedication? Have you found unexpected purpose or joy after experiencing profound loss? Share your thoughts below. Your stories might inspire someone who needs to hear them today.